If you guys have not seen, I covered the dev update over on Ginger Prime, gave my thoughts on it. I'm curious about Chris's thoughts, so that's what we're going to be talking about right now. Welcome in, everyone, and be sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more MMORPG content, discussions, and more. This is Brian and Chris for Work to Game, and we finally saw some really cool combat, but I've seen also online the reaction to this combat going in two different directions. And interestingly enough, and this is, I guess, part of the fun of MMORPG culture, like already, like there are teams forming. Like I've seen online Team New World and Team Ashes, and the reactions for myself, like, are one of two things. Like the nerd in me is just like, this is so funny, like, oh my gosh. And then like the adult and the dad in me is like, all right, okay, well, we still have years before Ashes comes out, guys. Like, what are we doing here? Like, we've already circled the wagons. Chris, have you had a chance to watch the combat update for the longbow and the shortbow?
So you told me to watch it last night, and my wife and I were doing all the things, the deferred maintenance around the house. We were, catching up on laundry, and we got our dog back and all that. And so, like, I was like, yeah, I'll watch it. I didn't know it was an hour and a half. So no, I haven't watched the whole thing.
Yeah, you just need to have some of it. Yeah,
I skimmed through some of it, and I showed it on stream earlier when you were talking about it, kind of just a little bit. Kind of let it play so that people can at least like visually see. So I'll kind of drag it over on the Twitch side right now. The Twitch side is the much less official. If you wonder why the YouTube videos end up a lot prettier than the Twitch side, where I just have like random Charlene music in the background, and there's like, things being dragged on the screen. That's because these are two different streams from two different places. But yeah, I think I personally, this is some of the first content, not the first content, but it's some of the first time that like I've taken more than a passing glance at Ash's coverage. They have been communicating, but the communication has been so far in the future that I just had trouble really listening intently. Outside of individual sound bites where they're like, we're going to have a smooth MMO launch. I'm like, why would you say that? And so I really liked a lot of this.
It's ballsy for sure. Like, I'm like, all right, I hope so.
I liked a lot of this, and not because I think this is the best combat system. I don't really care, because ultimately, like Destiny, looter shooters you talked about earlier, like there's not that many looter shooters in this space. It wouldn't matter if there were. Destiny, you don't know how good it is until you pick it up. And something about Destiny just feels good. So like watching this doesn't tell me if it's going to feel good.
Exactly.
So there's something about New World that just feels good. And like WoW and 14 effectively on paper have the same combat system. Very, very similar. There's some different, the global cooldown's different. There's off globals. Like there's some differences, but compared to every other video game in existence, they are basically the same thing, and they feel different. So, like, I'm really not that worried about a lot of people that are like up in arms about this isn't what I expected. I'm mostly just excited that they're ready to start committing to things, that we're getting to that point where like they're running out of time to go like, and it's still a work in progress. And this is like, it still says work in progress, but like, this feels like, okay, some of this is going to stay.
That's you bring up the point about how it feels, and that's the combat, like, and that's when with any game coverage, video game coverage, I'm always like, it's one thing to see it, it's how does it feel to play. And some of the things they highlighted, like the things that immediately stand out to me is, wow, this game is breathtaking. Like in terms of what they are showing within this little vertical slice of the game itself, running around. I like how they put slats into the hood for like an elf to have ears poking out. I really appreciated that finer detail. I love the enemy models, but more than anything else, I liked how the trees and the grass and the rocks, like everything just felt so like natural. Like it had this sense of like, wow, this is a place that I feel like I could get easily lost in terms of my own imagination and be absorbed by. And then essentially they showed off the combat. And I love the movement, obviously the kind of the vaulting and laying down, like suppressive fire and then ending up on the other side of the target. I was like, that was cool. Like that is something really interesting. The question ends up being is like, does that actually have like real implications of gameplay and strategy that's involved? And that's all going to come down to encounter design and more. Now, my disappointments, like when I was watching this, my disappointments came in, and the feedback that I'm providing is that I felt like enemies died too quickly. And obviously he's, wasn't unable to be killed in this regard, but it's like, I kind of was like hoping for a little bit more incentive to like team up with other people out in the open world. And these aren't champions. These aren't like high end, enemies. And maybe there'll be zones that have that, or like pocket zones within the areas. Like, oh, that is set up for people who want to play this in a multiplayer way. This is set up for a single player way. And then essentially, obviously the combat between tab targeting and action, or action camera. And when I heard that it's a tab target and action game, I was like, okay, that's gonna be interesting, but it's not. Like, what it is a Guild Wars 2 setup, right? Because like they were doing headshots, but those headshots aren't skill based. They're just, okay, you hit the target with that. And I think that's where all of a sudden started to see some of the rift and the frustration within the community going, oh, it's just a tab targeting MMO. It's like, well, yes and no. Like, I think I'm excited to see the Guild Wars 2 style come into play with the combat. But if I was looking for an action combat MMORPG, then Ashes is not that. What do you think?
Yeah. So with the enemy life was your kind of first big point there.
Yeah.
I think that is going to be something that's just textural. Diablo, one enemy is just not dangerous.
Yeah.
99% of the time. But the world feels dangerous in those higher torment or hell or whatever they want to call it levels, because there gets to be so many of them, or because something about it. World of Warcraft Classic, way back in the day, there were not that many enemies out in the world, but on classes like Warrior, where like you just ran out of resources and there was a respawn and you were busy eating, like the world could feel dangerous. And so there are other elements, like with how dangerous the world feels. That's what happens when it all gets put together. I do wish that Worlds had more engaging open world content. As a primarily Final Fantasy 14 player, the open world just doesn't feel dangerous.
Right.
And the only places it ever really has been these Bosja Zadnor like exploratory zones, and we end up going in there in groups of like 6 billion, and so then it's not dangerous anymore. It's still me AFKing in Eureka.
I want to jump in on just that thought though. It's like that is in and of itself is variability to content. That's what it's like. One of the things I like about that aspect is, yes, 70 billion of us could show up, or it could just be the two of us. And you never know. Like, it's not like, hey, it's always 70 billion or it's always just two. It always is fluctuating. And that's one of the things that I've really come to appreciate about, the competitor in this case. So as people are kind of phrasing it with the New World, is like in New World, sometimes there's a bunch of us just tearing things apart. And sometimes it's just me and maybe 3 other people. And it completely changes our approach, right? It completely redesigns that. And I think that's something that I feel has been missing in the landscape of MMOs that Zadnor and Bosja do as well. Because stepping in there, maybe I'm running with 70 billion people, or maybe it's just 4 or 5 of us. And that means that the same encounter is always different, because maybe you have enough people, or maybe you actually don't, and you have to change it up. And then in Bosja and Zadnor, they literally give you that option. So you can equip a couple different skills. Hey, we don't have a tank. Okay, how do we change this up? And for me, I just wanted to jump in on that. I'll let you finish your thought, because for me, I actually like that. I'm a weirdo.
I think sectioning it off so that people get to choose when it is a approach. You could also have it be random. WoW over the years, WoW Dragonflight just got confirmed for 11/28, which was actually what my spreadsheet predicted.
And you're
was
good,
the correct
dude.
date. But I get it wrong sometimes too. We just don't highlight those as relevant. And so I think that it's exciting to see kind of the rare mob type mentality, these big moments. You're like, oh God, I got to avoid that. New World does that with like, you'll come across a bear. In 14, the hunt mobs don't really feel like that. It doesn't feel like I was questing in a zone and a rare hunt mob came walking through and I had to change which order I did quests in to avoid them. There's not these big patrolling monstrosities that are going to just tear people up. As a matter of fact, hunt mobs are kind of agreed to like, oh, we wait and we kill them as a group. So there's this like etiquette that takes even the remote chance of danger completely out of it. And so like, I like the idea that there's something dangerous. I don't care if it's sectioned off, like the World of Warcraft Torghast zone or something like that, or like Bosja Zadnor in 14. I don't care if it's mixed in, which is how like Diablo does things. It's how like WoW rare mobs have worked back in various expansions. When rare mobs are dangerous, they're not always dangerous. So once again, like, as we start to talk about this coverage, like this is just me shifting from kind of laughing at how seriously this game's getting taken seriously to me just listening. I'm not honestly concerned because once again, like until we play it, like we don't know, he's in God mode, so we don't know.
Right.
And B, it doesn't really matter until it's all put together.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like if you have to
Yeah.
go kill 20 things a day to progress some in-town faction and those 20 kills are boring experiences, that's a problem.
Yeah.
But if if it's really fun to kill things and you never get told to kill them, that's also a problem. Because then you're at a bind because you're like, well, I'm doing the things I'm supposed to doing, but then I'm never getting to do the killing, which I'm really enjoying the combat system. So it's all about how it all fits together in an MMO. It does seem to have a lot of New World and Guild Wars in it as I watch it. And so your second point was about this like action combat. If there are two systems and it does not force you to toggle between them, if it is truly something where you can achieve the same outcome with either, people are going to shift to whichever one's easier.
Mm-hmm.
They might do their own thing when they're off, like being goofy.
Right.
But the moment that crap hits the fan and you're in hard content, people are going to shift as a general majority to whichever method makes it easier.
Yeah.
Because that's going to get you your clear. That's going to get you your loot. So I appreciate when people offer multiple control schemes. I think that's cool. As somebody that tends to shift towards, within the casual players, tends to shift towards the more optimal gameplay, it won't affect me. I don't play with the action combat camera in Guild Wars because the moment I did it, I was like, this just makes everything harder for no reward. So I just don't do it. So as a game that hasn't come out, my first thought is that that's feature bloat. And like, you have to add something worth chasing. But like for a game that hasn't come out, I wouldn't want somebody going, yeah, they should add a third combat system and a fourth combat. Like,
right. Yeah.
Let's just get the game out.
Get the game out. Absolutely. I still, there's going to be those that were wanting, and that's just coming down to the expectations. Like I've seen people who are like, I was all about this, and then what do you mean it's tab targeting? And it's like, okay, like they've been communicating that, like they have been communicating that. And then if you're not wanting that kind of game, like honestly, it's going to come down to the feel of it. Like in terms of the skills and the mobility and how they set it up, it could feel like the evolution of tab targeting where we haven't really seen that all that much in a while. And yeah, I want this game to be a success based off of just a paper alone. And I think that's going to be really interesting. But your point too, when they switched over to action combat and there was no incentive of skill in terms of that, like it does give you choice, which I'm all for. But as soon, like when you brought up as soon as it hits the fan, if it's like you're actually hurting the team because you're in action mode, or you're hurting the team because you're in tab targeting mode,
or you're
like
hurting yourself, right? You're out doing your solo content and it's just taking you longer.
Yeah. But it's man, I cannot wait to see more of it. And as we build into it, one of the things that I get a lot of flack for is like I've been saying, like this feels like a 2025 game, and if it comes sooner, then I'm going to be thrilled. But it's like when people are like, I was like, Alpha 2 isn't even this year, guys. Like Alpha 2 is next year. If they get into a beta next year as well, maybe we're talking 2024 at that point. But I don't want them to rush it. Like if they're like it's like no,
you don't
no,
want a 2025 game releasing in 2023.
Yeah,
right. That's how Anthem happens.
Yeah,
it was a great idea with a passionate team, and it just wasn't there. It wasn't a lack of people caring. It wasn't a lack of excitement. It wasn't that the community wasn't excited about it.
Yeah.
It wasn't that the devs weren't excited to work on it. It just wasn't ready, and it ran out of money, and it released, and that's how that happens. So like if it's not going to be ready till 2025, don't release it till 2025. Now that's easy for us to say. We're not the ones balancing the budget.
Right.
This has to get paid for. And like people can argue like, oh, well, they're not aligned with like a big publisher. Okay. All that does is remove one of the options of how they got their money. Like it doesn't mean that the money's not necessary. Those devs are still getting paid. So, I am interested to see kind of how much content they can put in on launch, what that launch time frame is, and how the other combat systems bake in, because they showed up a lot of this ranged combat, but like how is that going to feel when I compare that to other forms of combat? Like how is that going to feel when we start to put gear in the mix, when we start to put variety of the combat system, whether that's done through, depending on the game, whether that's
Mhm.
done through skill builds, whether that's done through gear builds, it doesn't really matter. As I start to have a different experience than you, does something like an action combat system put further friction where it's like, dude, your build tears them up. And so, yeah, you can play action combat, but like I am struggling over here.
Yeah.
Because game balance is something like 14 just went through kind of one of its rougher bouts of game balance. And compared to MMOs as a genre, it's not that bad. But compared to 14, historically, it is. And it's hard to swallow that. So, yeah, I thought it was awesome. It was awesome to see this much communication. I know they've been communicating a lot with their community, which I think is great.
I'm liking the monthly updates as well. I'm starting to get kind of spoiled on it, and that's one of the things that, well, not just with Ashes, but even with newer. Like when it comes down to it, like 14 really kind of set a tone, and it's cool to see what Yoshi P has established within the genre trickling out into other games, other MMOs. And the one thing that we haven't heard from for a long time is Blue Protocol, and like we haven't heard nothing about that game in a while, but like outside of like little hints and pieces. And I do think that if they are going to do anything along with Ashes and
Riot.
Riot, like it's like, okay, guys, make sure you have all your ducks in a row. You're going to communicate with your community at least once a month. Like having that video form, I think is very, very pivotal, critical. And the fact is they also had a video pre-recorded. Like it doesn't mean that you can't have a pre-recorded aspect of it for presentation purposes. People like that, but yeah, like literally be able to bounce between those as well. So all in all, like I'm amused by some of the frustration and the infighting, because my counter to anybody was like, New World sucks. It's like, I can play it right now. Like you don't have to like the game, but I could play this while I wait for that. Like there's no great sin in, oh my gosh, how dare you play this MMO that's out that people are enjoying, while you wait for this other MMO that people are excited about and hopefully people will enjoy. But
I'm ready to start talking about it on occasion. We're getting to that point where I'm okay talking about it on occasion. But I will say, like, I'm ready to talk about it the same way we talk about Riot. I'm ready to talk about it the same way we talk about Star Citizen. I'm ready to talk about it the same way we talk about the next Final Fantasy game from UGP. I'm not ready to talk about it the way we talk about World of Warcraft on the 28th, Guild Wars 2's End of Dragons constant wave of updates, Final Fantasy with upcoming patches always right around the corner, because that's just it's not fair to either side. It's not fair to hold Ashes of Creation to the standard of actually releasing content that I can play today. And it's not fair to penalize those games who actually had to make final decisions and hit publish and be like, well, they said it's going to be great and you did something and it wasn't great. So that's not fair to them, because it's way harder to do. And so I just want to have respect for games, especially when people are starting to compare it to games that have like 10 years of content out. Guys, these people haven't hit publish the first time. That is just not fair in either direction.
Yeah, I do hope MMO, the community can kind of get beyond that aspect of like, of course your new game didn't have 10 years or 20 years of content and history and expectation. It's like,
they haven't made 10 years of mistakes yet.
Yeah, exactly. Come on. Anyway, guys, that's our Ashes creation, especially combat talk. I'm more for me personally looking forward to like other forms of combat, but it seems like now that they're ready to show that off, they're building ever closer to Alpha 2. I'll be hopefully playing the Alpha 2 for you guys as well when that does drop, so that way I can give you guys hands-on impressions. So be sure to keep an eye out on all the content channels that we run for that as well. Chris, you got any final thoughts before we take our final break and then jump into our topic about Criterion?
Just thank you, Ritz, for 2 months of support over on Twitch, and I'm excited to talk about Criterion coming in Final Fantasy 14.
Like Ashes is like, I think that's why I see so many people frustrated. They're like, all right,
it was never going to live up to that.
Well,
that's why you and I were joking, like, oh my gosh, this is going to like improve our marriage, and it's going to fix the hole in my fence. And like, it's going to, because like, that's the only thing that could measure up to how hot the hype got. Like it just spiraled out of control, where like I came in the room and I'm like, what's this Ashes of Creation? Like, oh, it's only the greatest game to ever release. And I was like, oh, is it out? No.
Well, and then
I don't know how to keep up with this.
Yeah. Also, and then in terms of like MMOs, like, oh yeah, New World. I don't know. It's like New World has just finished year 1. Typically MMOs struggle 2-3 years historically, like unless Ashes comes out.
New World's not out of the. They're not out of the woods yet.
They're still in their early like figuring it out phase. But then essentially with Ashes is like, assuming Ashes doesn't have that problem, that's cool. It'd be a first because people are like, oh yeah, but Lost Ark didn't have that problem. Oh yeah, Lost Ark struggled in Korea. Like it was like they shuttered so many servers, but they got to work and they figured it out. And by the time that they released globally, imagine that you have all those problems
Right.
figured out. It's like, okay, cool. So the lesson for MMO launches should be like launch on an island.
Launch
Yeah,
regionally, right?
yeah.
Be a Australian only MMO or something.
Australian only MMO.
That way
Figure it
you're
out,
regional,
and then
figure
go
it out,
and then go wide.
and then that way you've only burned everybody who tried the game in that region and didn't like it. You kept all the ones who did like it, but you've burned as few people as possible for the maximum amount of feedback. And then when you go live for everybody else, you've got a 99% chance of a positive first experience.
Kai Spark says hype is a dangerous thing. Sometimes it may be better to stay in the dark about games. No expectations make everything a surprise. What hype is this? It's kind of this communal high, because when you look at it, people look at hype of anything. Like hype for Endwalker was massive, and the drop off was massive, but nobody cares about that drop off because it doesn't mean anything, right? Like so, it's like it's only when you don't have a track record that hype and that drop off falls off, because people are like, oh, they so and so this game lost this many players. It's like, did they
Just don't hit
have
the drop
them?
off early.
Right,
Like if
right.
you hit the drop off first and everybody else is still hyped, you're the villain. But then 6 days later, somebody else hits the drop off and you're like, oh wow, they're about to be villainized. And people are like, I know, right? It's awful. It's like, dude, what the hell? I said the same thing like 2 minutes ago.
Yeah.
And so like you want to be exactly in sync with the community as a whole, but I don't think any one person is. We're all having our own unique experience where we're all before or behind the train, but the train as a whole is what's setting the trend on like when it's okay to be excited, when it's mandatory to be excited, when it's okay to be upset, and when it's mandatory to be upset. And like you never align with all of those chapters.
Right. Agreed.